All right, everybody. In this lesson, we are going to be talking about components. And in fact, in this lesson and the next lesson, we're going to be talking about components. So before we get started, we need to figure out what a component is. It's much more of this concept than any kind of hard, steadfast rules, right? So a component, just going off our dictionary definition here, is a part or an element of the larger whole. And that's, worldwide, all industries wide, components are a small part of a larger whole, right? When we think of a car, we think of a component in a car, maybe one component is the motor, and one component of the motor is a piston, right? And so you can break each of these larger wholes down into very small workable things. Also, when we think about a car, we think that, if you know anything about cars or combustion motors, internal combustion motors, you know that a car tends to have between 4 and 8 cylinders, 8 pistons, right? But we don't design a new piston for each cylinder, right? We use the same design, the same mold, and the same everything for each piston. Even though there's 8 of them, right? It possibly 12 or more in a vehicle. There's multiples, but we still use the same exact one. And that's kind of the same way that we do it in development as well. So we're going to build this component, and then we're going to reuse it. So components are, I want to say they're single modular pieces of code. And by single, we'll get into that a little bit. And by the end of the lesson today, you'll be writing single modular pieces of code. But they're going to be made up of all 3, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? So we need all 3 of these items, all 3 of these quote-unquote languages to build a single component, right? Going back to our piston analogy, if you have a piston, you still need, right, a mold, a blueprint for that mold, some metal to pour in that mold. Same thing here. We need HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to build our component. So the main reason we build components, right, is that they're reusable. We know that we want to keep our code dry, and so we want to build these, could be a lot of code for one component, and we don't want to repeat ourselves all throughout our page or our application. We want to build this thing one time, and then we want to reuse it. Okay, and in the past, we've been, writing HTML, writing CSS, writing JavaScript, and that works really well if you're going to do one thing. But if you want to have, if you want to use that thing a lot, it really makes it worthwhile to compartmentalize all of that code into one piece of code, and then be able to reuse it. So another thing about components, usually they can stand alone, right? So if you have a component built for a page, oftentimes you can use that component on a different page, and it's still going to work the same exact way. It's still going to look the same. It's still going to act the same, right? So these standalone components are pieces of a much larger whole. And that doesn't really apply to the piston thing, because the piston doesn't really do anything unless it's in a motor. But it still has the ability to do something, whether it's in one motor or another motor, right? Car people are probably freaking out on me right now, like, oh, different size pistons, etc. But so these are the main concepts of a component, and we're going to go and break this little button component I've written down right here down, and then in the next video we're going to learn to start building our own components. So first thing we're going to do is look at our HTML. So I want you to pay attention to this, right? This is our button component, okay? Don't pay attention to this. It's just on there for visual effects. But so our button component, first and foremost, is a button element, right? It has a class. It actually has 2 classes on it. It has a button class, and it has a large button class, okay? You'll see a reason why in a moment why I did this. But this is, a button component, right? And I just have some text in here. This is a button component. So this is our HTML. And if we were to write this HTML out, this is, pretty simple. This is what we would write for a button. Let's go look at our CSS. So our CSS, we see that we are using the large button. We're using the large button class on here. All right, so it's got some CSS in here to make it look cool. It's got a hover to change the color. When you click it, it's going to look like it drops down, right? The box shadow. Let's do this. The shadow leaves. Okay, so it's got some functionality to it, right? And so think about this. If I had put the CSS on any other button, it would do the same thing, right? Or this class on not even any other button. I can write a div and it'll look like this still, right? Maybe a little bit different because button has some default behavior where it centers the text, etc. But yeah, so this large button class works in conjunction with our button that has the large button class on it, right? So that makes sense. Let's go look at some JavaScript, okay? So in this JavaScript, I got the button by the button class. I could have used large button here, but maybe I want to have this JavaScript for all buttons, and large button is just one of all buttons, right? But let's just think of it as a single component right now. I've added an event listener that's going to alert. The alert is that little pop-up that you saw earlier. That's going to tell me the button clicked says, and it's going to give me the text content of that button. So when I click the button, get that alert, pops up and says the button click says this is a button component. So we have all three of these things working in unison together. And they think about this. Could this be a standalone thing? Could this be reusable? Do we want, is there a time when you're developing your pages, is there a time when you think like, I'm going to need to create like 30 buttons? Do you want to write all of this out? Do you want to write all this out? Do you want to keep track of all 30 of those buttons in your JavaScript? Hopefully the answer is no. And then we can write reusable code. But just for now, let's go and let's create another button. Okay. So we're going to have another button. And I'm going to add a little bit of margin to this. 20 pixels on that. So we've got two buttons here, right? Pretty cool that we've already been able to just copy paste that code in and add a button to there, right? And it looks the same. Let's change what this says in here. Like, let's go second button component. Okay, so we've got two buttons here. We click this one, we're going to get the alert. It says this is a button component. We click this one, we're going to get an alert. Oh. Yes, that's why. Let's come in here and go query selector all. My bad. And then we will do button.for each B. And now, there we go. Okay, so let's go to our first one. We got our, this is a button component. We'll go to our second one, and we get second button component. So we're using the same code for multiple different elements on the page, right? We're still using that CSS. We're still using that same JavaScript. I had to tweak it a little bit to add the event listener to all of the buttons, but we see that we now have kind of a unique thing going depending on the data. So this is really where components start to shine. Before we end this video real quick, I do want to remind you that, naming conventions on CSS vary wildly. If you've ever done any kind of CSS, you'll see, there are very specified naming conventions. Probably the most popular one is BEM, B-E-M. It all just goes to show that we can name these things whatever, but we have these three pieces that are working together in unison to create a single component on the page. So this is a standalone, dry reusable, well, not reusable yet, not dry yet, right? Consists of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Single modular piece of code, not quite yet, but definitely a part or element of the larger whole, right? That's what a component is. And remember, this is very conceptual. This is there's no like steadfast rules that define components in the way we're talking about them right now. So you can do many different things to create a component. We're going to use one of those ways today. So that's your introduction to components, and I will see you in the next video.